So here we are with the Warrior Poet Project podcast. Very special podcast. Really looking forward to this. I'm here with Rick Doblin, who's the founder and director of the MAPS organization, Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. I had an amazing time at his conference recently. I've been aware of your organization for many, many years, and it's a real pleasure to be sitting down. And I also have one of the top researchers in the field, Dr. Charles Grob, who's been working with Rick for quite some time now, over what is it, over 20 years,
over
30
20
years?
Almost 25 years.
25 years. And helped push forward a lot of the different clinical studies that are some of the foundations for not only MAPS, but some other organizations as well. Okay. Why don't you tell us, some of your background as a clinician and then turned researcher?
Right. Well, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm a professor of psychiatry as well as pediatrics at UCLA School of Medicine. I'm the director of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Harbor UCLA Medical Center. I've been involved with research with psychedelics since the early 90s. With the support of MAPS, we conducted the first phase 1 study examining the effects of MDMA in normal volunteer adult subjects back from 94 to 95. Also around that time, I was involved with Dennis McKenna and Jace Calloway with a fairly extensive series of research investigations in the Brazilian Amazon, looking at the range of effects, short-term and long-term, of ayahuasca, the Amazonian plant hallucinogen decoction.
Our audience knows quite a bit about ayahuasca. I've been chirping about it for some time now, so we'll definitely have to get into that. Right. But let's take it a step back. So you decide to become a clinician, yes, and start practicing psychiatry. What diverts you to the path, or was it always kind of integrated into your own life?
No. This was something that had from very early on, my goal was to work with psychedelics. In fact, back in the early 70s, when I was in my early 20s, I had an epiphany one night, I should say.
As many of us do who are on the psychedelic path.
Unlike many of you, in an entirely drug-free state. I was actually a sleep-deprived state. I had left school and I was working as a research technician on a dream research study at the Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn, New York. And one of the investigators there was a psychologist named Stanley Krippner, who's still around. He's a professor at the Saybrook Institute in San Francisco. Well, at that time, in the early 70s, this was 72, 73, Stanley had a tremendous collection of books on psychedelics and articles. In fact, he had most of the articles on the range of psychological and medical effects of psychedelics up to that point he had. And my job was to stay up all night monitoring EEG tracings of our subjects who were in the sensory deprivation chamber. Well, I would stare at EEG tracings until they would go into an identifiable dream state. I could see that through rapid eye movements. And I waited for the dream to run its course and then to start to fade, and then I would wake the subject up over an intercom and I would tape record the content of their dream. I would ask them what was going through their mind. Well, but to stay up all night, I needed material to read.
Sure.
I love to read, and I discovered this incredible treasure of books and articles that Stan Krippner had, and I was just fascinated with psychedelics. I had some experience in the late 60s. I went to Oberlin College. It was hard to miss psychedelics at that point in time. Right. And I was very interested in psychedelics, and here I was doing the study at Maimonides Dream Research Lab. We're actually studying the phenomenon of dream telepathy, and it was actually funded by NIMH at that time.
Dream telepathy, what is that?
Dream telepathy. And basically, there are what the lead investigators, Stan Krippner and Montague Ullman, had identified was some individuals seem to have a great sensitivity and proclivity for experiencing telepathic phenomena during dream states.
You mean
And
communicating with other individuals?
not communicating with others, but picking up on phenomena elsewhere. So
Like premonitions? Or?
No. The model for the study was that we would give a sender, a designated sender, a sealed envelope. At a set point in time, he was instructed to take out of the envelope a picture. He would study it and then put it aside, go to sleep in the room he was in. Meanwhile, down in the other end of the hall in the sensory deprivation chamber was the subject, the dreamer, who had no idea what was in the envelope. But we would analyze the content of his dreams to see if there was any correlation. And some individuals seem to have an exquisite sensitivity for this phenomenon.
Now, did you have any statistically significant results in this? Anything that you could kind of track?
Well, if you can identify people with sensitivity who had an ability, you could clearly get statistical significance. And what the people at the Dream Lab were able to do was cultivate a population which they studied. And these were the people that I work with and but of course I needed to stay up all night, so I read.
All right, so we got. I'm going to chase this rabbit hole a little bit farther here. So how does that fit into your paradigm then? So let's expand this out. So let's say this phenomenon does exist. How do you explain the mechanism by which that this exists? Do you dare to go
I think
into
there's a great deal that we simply don't know. I was just quite impressed by observing the phenomena in and of itself. But if you look at psychedelics, you do hear anecdotal accounts of individuals reporting what they believe to be telepathic phenomena. In fact,
well, you hear about shared experiences quite often, where people have the same content.
Right. So you tell me that you and your audience are well versed in the ayahuasca and the lore of ayahuasca.
Yeah.
Well, here, a little known fact that when harmine, which is one of the primary alkaloids in ayahuasca, was first isolated and identified it by German chemists in the early 20th century, one of the first names attributed to the compound before they came up with harmine was telepathine. There you have it. And of course there's the great folklore that the tribal people, when taking ayahuasca, did have the capacity to communicate across great distances in such a manner.
Have you heard of, I'm sure you have, it's a silly way to start a question here, but the frog medicine combo?
Yeah,
I hear they have quite a potential. I think they use it for hunting, and it seems to help them locate animals in the forest. There's a lot of phenomena that are pretty interesting.
The use of plant hallucinogens in the Amazon are often used for purposes of healing, finding lost objects, and also assisting the people who participate in finding game, which are absolutely essential for the survival of the tribal group.
Sure. My own experience with ayahuasca, I've told the story many times, but I'll briefly summarize it. I went down to Peru, and they gathered together three of the great maestros of the area from different regions, flew them in for kind of a special meeting of the ayahuasqueros, and I was able to participate with one of them, master named Maestro Orlando Chuandama, long tradition of history. And the first day they call him the dragon because he's known for particularly strong medicine, and that's kind of his totem animal, which is unusual for someone in the jungle to choose that totem animal, but so it is. So the first night, I experienced my full death. The death of, my body was exploding with spiders and everything. And I was pretty cool with everything because it wasn't my first rodeo until finally the ayahuasca said, "Oh, you're dying of cancer right now. You're going to get it." And that got me. And I was like, "Oh, no, it won't happen. I won't go." And then finally I released. And of course, the medicine had done its job and brought me to the point where I accepted my death. And it was a really challenging experience. Well, the next night, totally different experience. Basically, I got put into a state of complete elation. I mean, I felt an ecstatic sense tingling between my toes and the top of my head like I've never felt before. It felt like my head was electric and just turned on. And I had visitation from these flotillas. One of them pulled the smoke out of my body, and then this metallic ship seemed to beam this light down underneath my tongue. and a really wild experience. And I was laughing and soaking in this energy. And then all of a sudden something clicked for me, and all the visions and everything kind of went away, but I could sense a dual reality, like another dimension came and smashed in on me. And the only people, the shaman was there in that dimension with me. The other people in the session weren't there. But the ability that I had to do things in that space was remarkable. Yeah. I mean, I was able, I just had a friend who got in a car wreck. And so I turned I was like, what should I do here? Because I was very lucid and felt like I have a power now. I felt like a superhero for a minute, and I looked to him and I could see him where he was, and I could look into his body. He was recovering. It's like, I don't know what to do. Well, maybe if I breathe some life energy into him or something. I didn't know what to do. But the power to be able to affect things, and I was able to actually look at my future business. Before then my business hadn't done very much, and see exactly the path I needed to chart. I saw it like a heart with different, arteries and veins feeding in, and how to unclog that and fix everything, from very technical marketing points to formulas to, I looked at that, I looked at different areas, and I then was so impressed with the abilities to do things in that state, that I ran out of the session and recorded a little video, which is on YouTube. It's like 60,000 hits or something. I'm like, you won't believe what's happening. I have to record it. It was like, I felt like I was in that movie Contact, and I just received some information. If I didn't talk about it, it would go away. But the point of this being is, when you get to that, and that doesn't happen every time. That's happened maybe one other time, not even to that extent. And I've taken ayahuasca, I've gone back to the jungle. But once you felt that, you understand that there is some other plane that you can access. I mean, they talk about it in terms of dimensions, and they called that the 8th dimension for them. That was their paradigm. And there's the dreaming dimensions, and then there's that one where you're very lucid and can kind of affect things. But once you've been there and felt that, you understand that there's other different planes, like layers of an onion, on top of this one, that you can go upward and then across and access information from. So that was my my own experience with it, but it certainly makes sense. And I think the dream state, according to their paradigm, is that first layer of the onion, where you're escaping our reality just a little bit, and so information could potentially travel through that. And of course, psychedelics get you to potentially that dimension, or maybe even, depending on the paradigm you use, of course, maybe the area that I was in, where you're fully awake and lucid, but can see everything with such clarity.
Well, the native peoples, who are the true experts in this area, had great facility in navigating these different realms of consciousness and to utilize them to resolve problems, crises, even forecast the future. They're not looking at business graphs and all the rest, but if there was a threat to the tribal group, if there was a need to find a new source of gain, these compounds were often used to serve that purpose.
So when you went to, we should finish the story. You had an epiphany, so let's go back to that. So before we get too tangential.
Very young, back in my early 20s. One night, I'm watching these EEG tracings and reading some articles and books about the potential value of psychedelics when used within psychiatry and medicine, and it just came to me that I really saw that doing research in this area, helping to explicate the range of effects of psychedelics, examining their potential to be utilized for purposes of healing, was just, to me, fascinating, inspiring. I heard Stan Grof give a talk shortly before then about his work at Spring Grove, Maryland.
For people who don't know Stan Grof, because we haven't touched on him very much, he was a pioneer both in holotropic breath work and LSD therapy, right?
Yeah, he is probably, both in Prague, Czechoslovakia, and then in Maryland after '67, he probably administered more psychedelics to patients in a legal setting than any other than anybody else in history.
So it was legal in Prague for a while.
Oh yes, in a research context, as it
Right.
was legal in this country in the 50s and 60s in a research context. And Stan Grob was really one of the great leaders of the field. I heard him give a talk at a humanistic psychology conference, I think it was late 1972, talking about administering LSD or DPT, dipropyltryptamine, another hallucinogen, to patients with terminal cancer who had overwhelming existential anxiety. And he had extraordinary results. He wasn't curing cancer or anything like that, but he was ameliorating this overwhelming, crippling anxiety.
Sure.
People would come out of
Which
it.
certainly doesn't help you heal. That's not the right environment to heal your body, is when you're under stress and crippling anxiety.
Right, right,
The
right.
cortisol levels alone, created from those
Yeah.
mental, emotional states,
Oh,
are
exactly.
detrimental to the healing cascade.
Exactly, but he focusing in specifically on their psychological reaction, he found it had great benefits. So that was also inspirational. So one night about 3 in the morning, I had this epiphany that that's exactly what I wanted to do. And at that point, I had dropped out of college, and
Yeah.
my father had been quite concerned of my apparent lack of direction. So he had told
What
me.
fathers aren't, really? No.
So he told me, son, if you ever figure out what you want to do with your life, I want you to call me. I don't care what time of the day or night it is. I want you to call me. So, here I was, 3 in the morning, and I had this epiphany that I knew what I wanted to do. So I picked up the phone. He wanted me to call him. I called him. So I woke him up, and I said, Dad, I figured it out. I know what I want to do. He said, oh, what's that, son? I said, Dad, I want to study psychedelics. I want to be a researcher.
Just what every father
with
wants to hear.
psychedelics. I think there's so much potential to learn about the brain, the mind-brain interface, mental illness, these extraordinary models to treat people where conventional treatments don't work. And he said, much to his credit, he said, well, son, there may be something to what you say, but no one will listen to you unless you get your credentials. So I knew at that point
Yeah.
I had to go
He
back
was
to
right.
school. He was absolutely
He was
right. I
right.
went back to school. I went to Columbia. I did all my pre-med. I went to medical school. I first went into internal medicine, then neurology, then psychiatry, and
then you wind up with Dennis McKenna in the jungle doing studies on ayahuasca.
yeah,
Fast
exactly.
forward later.
Well, yeah, but going back when I entered psychiatry, psychedelic research was completely shut down. It was virtually taboo to even talk about it, in an open setting. It was no longer tolerable. So I just plugged away, kept getting more credentials, stayed on an academic track, first at Johns Hopkins, then in California, and eventually got into a situation where I met Roger Walsh, who was a psychiatrist at UC Irvine, who also had a shared vision that this was of great potential value and should be studied again. And Roger gave me he was a senior professor, I was a junior assistant professor. He gave me a lot of encouragement to pursue my passion, as he called it. And around that time also, I met Dennis McKenna. I had heard his brother speak.
Sure.
I heard his brother speak about his little brother Dennis, who was a ethnobotanist and pharmacologist who was doing a postdoc at Stanford. So on an impulse, I picked up the phone one day, tracked down Dennis's telephone number, called him up, and invited him to give a grand rounds at the hospital I was at. So Dennis accepted, and we really he gave a great talk. We really hit it off, and he started to tell me about his interest in ayahuasca and about a research protocol he would one day want to pursue. And at that point in time, he said that he had a collaborator who was a psychiatrist. I don't want to mention his name, but I knew this person fairly well. And I said to Dennis, I think when it comes to crunch time, this psychiatrist is going to drop out.
Yeah.
He's not going to want to go to the Brazilian Amazon with you. And I tell you what, when you hear from him that he's dropping out, call me up, because I want in.
Well
on
played.
this. I want
Well
in.
played,
And
Dr.
sure
Bill.
enough, about a year later, I get the call, and it's, Charlie, are you still interested in going to the Brazilian Amazon? And I said, you better believe it. Let's do it. So that's how I got involved in the first ayahuasca study in '93. And later I did a subsequent ayahuasca study in 2001 with Marlene de Rios and some Brazilian researchers we were asked to come down and evaluate the psychological functional health of adolescents who were participating with their parents in religious ceremonies run by the União de Vegetal, the UDV, one of the Brazilian syncretic religions. So I've done 2 major ayahuasca studies.
Well, I definitely want to get into discussing that a little bit more, but let's bring you into this picture here, Rick, and
Okay.
talk about how you kind of came. I know you gave in your opening talk at the conference, you kind of told your story, how you kind of came about this, and came from kind of a personal benefit space, and then wanting to give back and share that with the world. So if you want to kind of bring our audience a little bit up to speed on that, and then we'll get into the details, the nitty gritty of what you guys are doing these days, because it's really exciting stuff.
Okay, thank you, Aubrey. So I was raised in the Chicago area. My family's Jewish, and I was, for somehow or other, one of the family stories is that I thought the whole world was Jewish. My friends, my parents' friends, all of them were Jewish.
Right. Well, your world was.
My whole world was Jewish. And so there was this point where I was 6 years old, and my parents were sort of, it's like telling your kids that Santa Claus doesn't exist or something. They were telling me that the whole world isn't Jewish, and that only the very tiny minority is, and that was like terrifying to me. But we also have a lot of Israeli relatives and distant relatives that were killed in the Holocaust, and my parents were very left-wing political in their orientation, and I felt like I was raised to be aware that one of the purposes of my life had to be to wrestle with this fact that whole cultures can go crazy and that can dehumanize others and attempt genocide.
Yep.
That was something that I needed to do. And I also had this sort of crisis later on of what to do about the Vietnam War. So I was the last year of the lottery, and so I felt that not only was there, insanity abroad, but I felt that there was
Insanity at home.
Insanity at home, and I felt that I was not willing to go to war, but I also was not a conscientious.
And you were drafted.
No, I was in the year of the lottery. I was exposed to the lottery potentially. I never actually registered for the draft. That was my approach to this, is that what I realized is that nonviolent civil disobedience was the approach that I wanted to follow, and that the system, this war-making system, that I wasn't a conscientious objector, because I felt that people like Hitler and the German war machine, that it's appropriate sometimes to defend yourself.
Yeah, my father once told me that was, in his opinion, one of the only wars that he felt was justified.
Yeah.
That was the one that you got to do something.
Yeah. So I felt like the way it was set up regarding the Vietnam War is you could be a conscientious objector, but you had to say that you objected to all wars. And I felt that wasn't me. And at the same time, I also felt that you want to drain the most energy that you can from the war-making system, and that we're indoctrinated in a lot of ways that we don't even notice. And so the more I started looking at this, the more I realized that if I didn't register for the draft, that then they'd have to come find me. And so that if I didn't do the very first step, that would be the way to drain the energy. And I anticipated not running to Canada, but going to jail. Martin Luther King had talked about how people who broke the law and then suffered the consequences in order to be an example for others actually had the highest respect for the law.
Right.
And so that inspired me. What that meant to my parents, my dad also, as Charlie's dad was a doctor, and their view was that I would have a criminal record and I would never be able to be a professional of any kind. And I felt that was a price I was willing to pay, rather than go into this war situation. And I also had this very successful grandfather who was a successful business person, and I knew from around the time I was 14, 15, something like that I would inherit about $150,000 that would make it so that I could survive. I could buy food and pay rent.
Sure.
It wasn't like a massive fortune or anything, but that it was enough for survival. And what that meant is I had freedom. I could do whatever I wanted. I didn't have to have a normal job. That I could survive, and that I could then focus on responding to the sort of cultural insanity that I saw so clearly.
So what gave you this kind of clarity? Was it your family? Was it your parents? Was it something that you did internally? How did you see these things so clearly?
Well, I think it was my family, and also I was a serious guy. I was very involved in reading books, intellectual.
Sure.
I wasn't very in touch with my emotions at all. And I just grew up with this sense that I, in a way, I'm the product of a multi-generational process, that my grandparents, great-grandparents, that they were immigrants, came with nothing, and that they were to focus just on survival, came from Europe, the old country. Their job was survival. Then the next generation down, they thrived in America. They assimilated, they thrived, and then that gave me the freedom to work on the deeper threats. And the more you understand Jewish history, it's all this whole litany of people trying to exterminate the Jewish people throughout thousands and thousands of years, and and so that just sobered me up, and I was very privileged to be able to respond to that in some way. I just felt that was my obligation. I just remember the first time I heard the Beatles songs, and I was just like, that's so stupid, these silly love songs. It's like, who cares about that? There's this serious stuff going on. And
right.
so I was, not very emotional, dismissing those things. And then at the same time, I was raised to believe that psychedelics made you permanently crazy, that one dose, something happened in your brain, and then you were screwed for life.
You're going to be hiding under a table somewhere, shivering. Yeah.
Incapacitated, unable to read a book, and just somehow that they were really bad. And my parents didn't drink, they didn't smoke, so we kind of had no drugs in our house, and
no altered states of consciousness, period.
None at all. And I understand that now in a different way, that the irrational, when you let it loose, that's what Hitler was a master of, is motivating people's irrational fears and anxieties, and getting them to lose their individuality and to become a group that can then easily be manipulated.
Sure.
So I felt this this need to try to be my own person, to think my own thoughts, and it was really through a book. A friend of mine, I was interested in studying the other, so this was also at a time of the arms race with Russia, and the whole idea that in school you would practice duck and cover, get under your school desk, and that would help you survive the nuclear holocaust. So I was in fear of World War, nuclear catastrophe as well. And so I recognize now we have it in terms of global warming, and it's becoming more and more clear in terms of environmental destruction that really things are imperiled.
Sure.
But I felt that somehow I needed to respond to this, and so I was studying Russian, and I was studying the other. And this guy in my Russian class had this, who I really liked, and he gave me this book to read, and I read it, and I thought it was fantastic, and I handed it back to him. And he said, you realize that some part of this book the person wrote on LSD? And I'm like, that can't possibly be. This is a phenomenal book. And of course it was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. So that started changing my mind about LSD. And then when I ended up going to college, and I went to New College of Florida, and it was an experimental college with the idea that the student's curiosity was the most important thing, and that you need to facilitate that. There was no grades, written evaluations instead of grades. And what they didn't say in the brochure that went to the parents is that they had this tradition of all-night parties with psychedelics.
How dare they? How dare they?
And they had the tradition of there was a swimming pool. There was a woman, her name was Marian Hoppen.
Does this college still exist? Because I think you've just put out the recruiting poster. Whatever college this is.
This college,
you got people enlisting already here.
Well, it still exists. It has merged with the state. The other part was this woman, Marian Hoppen, who was like this 80-year-old woman. She'd studied with Jung. And she was teaching Jungian psychology at the college, and her family was fairly wealthy. They donated this Olympic-sized swimming pool to the college.
Nice.
But for whatever reasons, it became a nudist colony.
The pool did.
The pool did. And it had, not only was it the pool, but it was a big
nude pool parties.
Well, the parties
at the Olympic pool.
Well, the college
Terrific.
actually was
Outstanding.
The buildings were designed by I.M. Pei. This, well-known architect, and they were designed to turn into a motel if the college failed. So every room had balconies, and it was all around this central palm court.
Does this exist? Is this a real story?
This is hard to believe it's real. Well, in fact, Earth and Fire from Arrowwood, they were friends of mine from college.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. Alan Harper, who does a lot of work with the
For
ACLU.
people who don't know, Arrowwood.org is one of the top resources for information, trip reports, research articles on basically any psychedelic substance. They take a very kind of unbiased approach and just give you the facts as well they see it and the reports as well they see it. So it's a good place to do your own research if you're interested in exploring any of these fields.
Yeah, so at this college, I decided that I would try LSD. And the very first time I tried it, I had this sense that there was the intimation of profound depths within myself, but that also they were blocked by a lot of my over-intellectualizing, that I didn't have a fluid access to my emotions, and that I felt, though, that the rituals that we have in our lives from our religions, most of them, at least for me and for many people, have not sunk very deep. They've been fairly hollow, and I felt that my bar mitzvah, didn't turn me into a man.
Yeah.
My
That's one of the topics I harp on quite a bit. I mean, there's no genuine coming of age ritual at all. So it's this kind of nebulous transference from boyhood to adulthood, where at some point you're like, shit, I guess I'm an adult now. You know, and it's very interesting.
And I think the whole, the rave movement, the festivals, Burning Man, Boom, all sorts of festivals, psychedelic festivals, are that rites of passage for many people. And it speaks to just a deep human need that we have, both to have those deep experiences and to do them in some communal way.
Yeah, I just, one of my favorite books is Aldous Huxley's Island.
Oh, yes.
And his description, and he's actually one of my favorite authors in general, but the way that he describes that ritual, where the younger adolescents, they climb that strenuous climb up to a mountain shrine, and there they ingest the moshka, which is probably some psilocybin or something that he imagined. I think he was hoping to create like the perfect psychedelic drug that combined mescaline and psilocybin and whatever, but whatever his psychedelic was. And so combining some conquering of fear, physicality, joining of the group, and then that incredible mind-expanding experience that you can get from psychedelics. So that, that seems to me like that would be the way to.
Yeah. Well, we were just talking about Island this morning, as well. But I would say that the lesson I've learned from Island is that there is this paradise, basically, that Aldous Huxley writes about.
And you went to college there, but...
And I went to college there.
Other than that...
But the ending of Island is that this remote island paradise where they have incorporated access to the full range of states of consciousness, that it's an enlightened society, that it ends up being destroyed by the oil industry.
Yeah.
So the idea for me was that and Aldous Huxley, from what I've heard, changed his mind as he was writing the book. The idea of the destruction of this paradise came to him as he was writing. It wasn't originally his intention to talk about the destruction of it. And so the lesson is, to me, that there are no private utopias. There is no way that we can find our own little niche. And that was, I think, a big theme of the 60s, was that we can tune in, turn on, drop out by Timothy Leary, that people could go back to the land and create the communes, and that we could somehow...
So they can't create any kind of actual infrastructure. But I think one of the interesting things, almost the poetry of the ending of Island, is that, that as the tanks roll by or the trucks roll by, he talks something about the crickets still chirping and the wind still blowing through the leaves, basically saying that we still have a right to control our own consciousness, our own experience, and create our own utopias, even if we can't right now, at least, physically create.
I think
Charlie,
the end.
I'll say, so the last thing just is that for me, the idea of social change is to go to the heart of the problem, to go to mainstream psychedelics, to go to the center and try to reform from the outside, from the inside out, because there is no other way, and we know that now with again with global warming, things are too global and universal and too interconnected.
No, I was just going to say the ending in Island, I think, reflected Huxley's growing perception that the greater culture at that time in the early '60s was not ready for psychedelics, and would not be able to tolerate their emergence. But here we are, half a century later. The question is, are we ready now?
Yeah, and I'd say on that.
Well, and there's another question: are we? If we're not ready, is it going to be too late?
Well,
right.
Sometimes you just got to jump. Maybe you can fly, maybe you can't.
Well,
but
also,
we may be running out of time here.
Well, the other issue is the growing degree of environmental catastrophic problems that are emerging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons for being hopeful about the culture being ready. I mean, one factor is just the emergence of psychedelic research all over the world now, more psychedelic research going on in legal context than any time in the last 45, 50 years.
Absolutely.
But I think that if we look at what happened in the 60s, so I'll just say, so then I was waking up to psychedelics at the time that Nixon was saying that Timothy Leary was the most dangerous man in America. And then I found that nobody came after me for not registering for the draft. So I had found this way out of the whole struggle. All these people were, people were shooting themselves in the foot or cutting off fingers, doing different things so they wouldn't pass their physicals. And I just had to not participate by registering, and nothing happened. So that's where I decided that what I would devote myself to was to become a psychedelic therapist. And that both because I needed the therapy myself and because I thought that the sense of connection, the essence of the mystical experience, that transcends boundaries, all the different ways that we subdivide ourselves by our race or our religion or our nationality or our sexual orientation or all these different ways. So at age 18 I felt like, okay, now this is what I'm going to do. But I woke up to it just after the backlash had sort of completely succeeded in wiping out psychedelic research all over the world. So
what was that? All right, so let's talk about a little bit about what you feel was the motivation for that. Because the backlash. Like what were people so afraid of?
Yeah. Well, I think people were afraid of the raw stuff of life. Mm-hmm. So if we look at what's different between now and then, and by that I mean also that people were, we're now used to it. My son is, was playing, these Halo, multi-party games with, people, and he was playing with somebody from Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
So kids these days are totally used to globalization, to one world, to the global warming, but I think at the time, people were more stuck. I even believe it took me a while, only really like the last 10 years, that I started questioning the American exceptionalism, that we're the greatest nation on world in the history of the world because we're somehow better than other people.
Right.
So I kind of bought into that, unconsciously. I think that in the 60s, people didn't talk about death. My aunt died of cancer when she was 21. And my family didn't even tell her that she had cancer. That birth was completely different. Women were tranquilized, men weren't involved in the delivery room. Spirituality in terms of meditation was seen as completely weird.
Do you see organized religion as the culprit? Like, where did this ship get off course?
Well, let me say something. Psychedelics in many respects are catalysts for change.
Sure.
And in the 60s, I don't think the culture was ready for the kind of change, the altered perspectives, the altered views that people would develop. Mm-hmm. And also, psychedelics were interfused, with the anti-war movement. The counterculture, fed
Sure.
into the anti-war movement, and it was seen as, as a threat to the state, a threat to cultural stability. There was also the problem that, to an increasing degree, very young people were experimenting on their own without any guidance, without any sense of how to optimize safety, and
integrate it,
inevitably,
yep.
some young people and some older people got into a lot of trouble and had psychological breakdowns to one degree or another, and this alarmed the authorities. Unfortunately, it took the rug out from under the momentum that was going on in psychiatric research with psychedelics. There were some great advances being made, but because of the cultural reaction, everything got frozen. Everything was
Sure.
halted in its track and shut down for decades until Rick came along.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
both of you guys came along.
Yeah,
it
but
sounds
I
like.
think where we're at now is that in 1974 was the first hospice to sort of change our approach towards death, and now in 2004 there was over 3,500. So it takes multiple decades, generations for culture to adapt. The birth process is completely different now. There's birthing centers. Women aren't tranquilized as much. Men are in
Sure.
the delivery rooms. We accept meditation and yoga as something that's potentially healthy, that people can do it and integrate it within their business life or the rest of their life. And there is this growing sense both of crisis in terms of what we're doing to the environment, and then also in terms of this growing sense of how we're interconnected, which I think is challenging all of these fundamentalists. And
Yeah.
what seems like a retreat to fundamentalism is a sign of weakness, I think, rather than a sign of strength.
It's a backlash to the trend that's already developing. Yeah.
So I think that, as Charlie is saying too, that our culture is ready for it, but that we have to be very careful and slow and methodical, and we also have to be much more aware of the downsides, that there is no panacea. Psychedelics are not a panacea,
Sure.
that the cultural context can actually overwhelm the power of the psychedelic for change. And if you look at some of the ayahuasca churches, they're hierarchical, homophobic, patriarchal.
That's something that is definitely a misconception. I mean, people think that if you do the medicine, you're going to be a good person.
Yeah.
Right. And I've known of shamans who have been in the traditional lineage, 10th generation shamans and different medicine keepers, both ayahuasca, iboga, different things, who just because they know the medicine and do it doesn't mean they're actually good or moral individuals.
Right.
And you get these cases and stories of different people abusing their power, taking advantage of people while they're under the influence of the medicine, and it can be an incredibly powerful, useful tool. But if someone makes the conscious choice to override that, the mind is amazingly powerful as well.
Yeah.
And you can use these altered states either for recreation or for ill will, for malice.
Sure. Charlie Manson used to dose his group, his cultic followers, and plant suggestions in them that they should go out and do horrible acts. So just taking a psychedelic doesn't necessarily turn you into a good person.
Right.
It's really all about setting, intention, context, integration afterwards.
A lot of, like the Castaneda books were really big at one time. And if you look at them now in retrospect, a lot of them were about struggles for power. They weren't about mystical experiences necessarily. They weren't about healing. They were about shamans struggling for power. So what really came together for me, and we talked about Stan Grof earlier, is that I found that myself, when I first started taking LSD, that I had the intimation that this could be healing, but I felt that my personality, my culture, that I wasn't really ready for it.
Yeah.
And so I ended up having difficult LSD experiences, quite a few, but I kept at it. But they were very difficult. I had a hard time letting go. And so I went to the guidance counselor at this Paradise College. And the guidance counselor, as you would anticipate at a college like this, was very sympathetic.
Yeah.
And he said that he had a manuscript copy of Realms of the Human Unconscious by Stan Grof. before it was even published as a book, and he suggested that
Of course he does.
Of course, and he suggested I read it, and so I read it.
You
And
go to a guidance counselor now, and they say, you probably have mono, and let me give you some Adderall, and get back to work.
yeah. So when I read it, this book was about, for me, the saving grace, and what I'm working on, there's two of them. One is science, and the other is healing.
Mm-hmm.
So Stan was focused on the scientific investigation of spiritual and therapeutic experiences. So the self-critical, the constant search for truth that science represents, that he was talking about this scientific process that was looking at questions of spirituality, values, different religions. But his reality testing, his approach was, are we able to use this to heal people? In terms of psychotherapy, can they be happier? Can they be more productive? So I think rather than going into these altered states with the goal of power, if the goal is healing, and rather going in trapped by the cultural background that you've grown up in, but liberated by this ruthless pursuit of the truth that is what the scientific process represents, that I thought that combination, the science and the healing and the psychedelics, with the understanding that the political implications of going through all of these experiences to having this sense of unity would produce people who were more tolerant and less scared of the other.
Right.
That was something that was worth devoting my life to.
I think that makes sense. The way I can kind of describe it is there's a lot of steps you can take to get that kind of awareness. Meditation obviously works. Spending time camping out in nature, you can kind of relax your bodily systems, remove your mind out of the way. All of that is very helpful. Isolation tank, flotation tanks are a great tool, different tools. But to really, when you're really off balance, like most of us are, our world isn't conducive to being and living in that state of balance. These psychedelic medicines can really move a lot of earth. They're a bulldozer, not a shovel or a spoon. You can start to move material and make changes faster if your intent, setting, everything is in the right way. It's just giving you more force and more momentum to achieve something that you want to achieve.
Yeah, and I had in a way the good fortune of learning a lesson pretty early, which is that you can't do everything in the altered state. So that I tried to expedite my development. I saw the 60s crash and burn, and I realized that a lot of it was from the backlash, but a lot of it was self-inflicted by the advocates, the leaders who had their own problems that weren't fully working through them.
Yep.
And that there was this, an arrogance and immaturity. And so I ended up realizing that I would just, I felt initially that I would do these psychedelics very, very frequently and often at higher doses, in order to sort of accelerate my development. And I ended up doing a 3-week primal therapy intensive where I was alone in a room for 3 weeks and got out an hour a day to work with a therapist. Couldn't have books, got super into my dreams. I did, month-long encounter groups. And I felt that I wasn't where I wanted to be. And I sat home. I went to my parents and moved back home for a couple months. And after my epiphany about being interested in psychedelics, the second idea was that I needed to get grounded, that you have to work in balance, and that balance, and that I was so over-intellectualized and so ethereal that I needed to start building things. So I ended up having 10 years of building things, building houses, building custom wood houses, and that really helped me get grounded. But I think that it's too easy to talk about the psychedelics without talking about the integration. And so in the studies that Charlie and I are trying to work on now with MDMA for autism, or in the work that he's done with psilocybin with end of life, and the work that we do with MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, there is a long therapeutic process punctuated by these psychedelic experiences as sort of, like you said, the bulldozer to open things up. But then it's encased in this non-drug psychotherapeutic process to anchor those experiences.
Absolutely.
And to integrate them. And I think it's all too easy for people to not so much pay attention to the preparation and the integration and just focus on the drug experience, and that's in no way enough, and that's where we can go off track.
This is all about optimizing safety and therapeutic outcome. The more care you put into preparation, cultivate the intention, establish rapport, do it in an optimal setting, help with integration afterwards, it all leads to greater likelihood of positive outcome and safer outcome.
You know, I get a lot of people ask me and come to me about these. You know, there's some ayahuasqueros who come make their tour through the U.S. and obviously they're doing that in an illegal setting, which is something I can't consciously recommend to people. I've always gone down to Peru to do it myself, but there's also something to be said, and I'm sure there's good medicine and good healing that's happened. I've heard good reports from it, but there's something to be said of not just, you know, okay, maybe you skip a meal if you're going to do ayahuasca here in, you know, San Diego or something like that. But when you're actually going down to the jungle, you know, you're meeting with the shaman or the ayahuasquero, the curandero beforehand. You know, you get on a dieta, you're in the set and setting, you start to kind of sink in, and it doesn't even have to be a lot of talking about the preparation or talking about the integration. You know, just being in part of that process can get you a lot of the way there, you know, because they've built that kind of tradition around it. So you take the medicine, you go back to your hut, you hear the sounds of nature, the jungle, you know, then you see him the next day, and depending on, I remember I had a funny experience where at one of my sessions, he blew a lot of the Nicotina rustica, the tobacco that they use down there, just all over my body. And I was like, oh, this kind of smells good and interesting. I didn't have a very deep experience. Went back, and I had the most ridiculous purge of my life. I was out of every orifice, like a madman, like a fire hydrant. The person who was rooming with me was just cracking up. And I was like, I don't understand. I don't know what's going on. And then, of course, the shaman comes to me the next morning and just smiles. And he knew exactly what he was doing with that intention. And
if we're going to use these compounds, I think it's really important that we learn from the native peoples that have worked with such plants for millennia. And they understand how to optimally structure for safety and for outcome. The diet for something like ayahuasca is very important. Also, there's sexual abstinence, which a lot of North Americans and Western Europeans don't want to address, but there's a reason why the native peoples do have that as part of the preparation.
Mm-hmm. I think we also, though, have to be careful here of this kind of naive romantic notion that these people from the jungles for thousands of years are somehow or other so in tune with nature that we should, from our Western civilization, adopt what they're doing. And so I think, Aubrey, you were speaking about how they have within their culture certain ideas that are difficult for us that we would reject.
Sure.
So I think that there is a lot that we have to learn from them, but also it's a two-way street. And I think the scientific process, the skepticism, and a lot of what concerns me with ayahuasca and shamanism is the power dynamics. Mm-hmm. So that, you know, often you will hear about shaman who take the drug and then do it to you. Mm-hmm. You know, sometimes people don't even take the drug. The shaman takes the ayahuasca and then does all these rituals and then heals you. So I think the idea that we have encased in what our therapeutic approach is, our treatment manual, which is on the MAPS website if people want to read it, about our approach to MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, it's this understanding about empowering the individual to heal themselves, and that's the real source of the healing. And we want to help people to work within their own psyches in a more effective way, but that they have to do the work, so that you can take a psychedelic and you can run away from your issues and not make any progress, or you can take it and do difficult
sometimes
work.
You can try to run away, but it'll catch you. it'll track you down from behind like Ray Lewis and tackle you even worse if you try to run away.
That's true. Yeah, for me, I do see that the key to doing LSD is surrender.
I think the key to most of these things, you know, witness, allow, surrender, and that's a big part of it. The more you fight, the less headway you're going to get, and the more challenging your experience will be.
Yeah. But I don't think there's this ancient wisdom that we can adopt and transfer without translation into the modern context. I think we still have a responsibility to bring what we've learned from the Western culture to bear on this. And that's where I see right now there's an incredible interest in science and religion coming together. that I think has been blocked for hundreds and hundreds of years. So that there are now studies that are being done with meditators who are being administered psilocybin to see if it deepens their meditative practice. And it used to be, when we had the backlash of the 60s, there was this incredible exploration of non-drug approaches. And many of the religions, many of the schools of meditation, Zen meditation, they have this antipathy towards drugs, their intoxications, and at least in their presentation. And so I've found now that, 40, 50 years later, there are people who have given up drugs, who have been lifetime meditators, who are now finding that they can make more progress by reintegrating psychedelics, not giving up the meditation, but that these kind of blended approaches are, I think, more powerful. And also, as we have science look at questions of spirituality, mysticism, I think it was Albert Einstein that talked about how true science and true religion are not really opposed to each other at all.
Well, certainly when you start looking at the new quantum physics discoveries that are coming out, everything is starting to emerge a little bit. A little bit more. But I think you're bringing up a good point, and I think people tend to want to polarize themselves on one way or the other. Everything indigenous is good. That's not true. And then some people say, only science is good. This is all magic and fairy tales and crystals, and that's all bullshit.
Right.
I think really the key is to combine everything. I mean, we have the resources now with the globalization, with the access to combine the wisdom that the native people have brought, integrate that. All right, maybe we can't bring the jungle along with us, but they've learned from experience some very valuable things that they can apply to the process. Maybe we can do that in our own way. Or, for some of us, going actually back there to do it really works well. It certainly worked well for me. But combine the traditional with the scientific, with all the other research that we've gotten from other fields, the meditation fields and everything, and combine a cohesive system of just practical matters of what works, what creates the best, most reliably good outcome for people. And I think it's going to be a combination of everything. But I think you're cautioned to not be overly romantic about either side, or you can caution the other way, not to be so into the science that you disregard the wisdom from 3,000 years of use or however many thousand years. I think the key is to kind of bring it all together, and that will ultimately, in the utopia that I see, potentially that's what it is. It's a combination of learning the scientific, what the mechanism of action exactly is, how to best prepare yourself, and then combining that with, the best research and how to integrate, how to prepare, and then perhaps even bringing back in some kind of, because I think people need something of a little bit more of a ritual too. I think that can add a real element to it, some kind of anchor in something that's not part of their normal world, and I think that does add something special and unique to kind of landmark the experience. So bringing back in a bit of that traditional cultural symbolism, if nothing else. I mean, that to me is the ideal future for what this could potentially be. And the steps you guys are taking are what's absolutely vital. Getting these drugs looked at as potentially therapeutic. Because as you've mentioned many times in the conference, they have a list of the way that they're classified, and you can jump in at any time, is that they have no clinical benefit and have only negative results. Well, you're proving quite the opposite with everything that you're studying.
Yeah, just for some of your listeners who might not know this other part of my history. So, I spoke about being basically a drug-using rebel, a criminal. But the arc of my
They're
life...
still thinking about these psychedelic all-night swimming pool parties. Don't worry about that. They've forgotten about that. They don't hold that other against you. To me, it's a pattern of good choices that you've established.
Good fortune, yeah. But the arc that I'm trying to work on with my own life and also with the psychedelics is to sort of integrate them in the mainstream. So I did realize that the politics were blocking a lot of this research, and so I felt that it was important for me to move my primary focus from becoming a psychedelic therapist myself to becoming a therapist for the culture. So I ended up going to Harvard, to the Kennedy School of Government, and have a master's and a PhD from there in public policy, particularly about the regulation of psychedelic medicine and psychedelic research with Schedule I drugs. And so I've become more mainstream as I've grown up in many ways, although I have this strong interest in psychedelics. And I think that our culture is at this point where we have been able, through Charlie and I and others, have been able to work with the regulatory agencies around the world with the psychedelics. So we can work with the police, with the DEA, with the FDA and the European Medicines Agency, and with institutional review boards that were created to protect the rights of the human subjects after the Nazis did all these experimentations on people, that we can now work with regulatory agencies to get permission so that it's not such a unusual thing. But what is unusual is that we cannot do this with marijuana. So that right now the federal government has a monopoly on the supply of marijuana that can be used in government-approved research. I mean, it's ludicrous to say that the government has a monopoly on the supply of marijuana, but we tried for 7 years to buy 10 grams to do the first studies on vaporizers, and we had to buy it from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. They refused to sell it to us. So that
it seems like, don't you think that trend is already kind of happening, though? I mean, with the medical legalizations in these states, I know the government's trying to tinker with those laws and mess them up a little bit, but it seems like that's already going to work.
Well, I think so, and I think, again, one of the first lessons at the Kennedy School is, there is no such thing as the government.
Right.
That there's different individual parts of it sometimes working at odds, that there's not this unified government all going the same way. So that I think the resistance, that it's like a river running downhill and going around boulders. So the resistance to doing medical marijuana research, which has been in existence pretty much since around 1968, 1970, when marijuana was discovered to help control nausea for cancer chemotherapy patients, and to help them get their chemo, and to help them generate an appetite. And at that point was when the research was really obstructed. That ever since then, the support has been emerging around the federal route, the FDA route, to make medicine. So New Hampshire just became the 19th state to endorse medical marijuana on Tuesday of last week, a few days ago. New
Hampshire, why are you 19th? Your motto is live free or die. Get with the program, New Hampshire. You should be number one. Look at your state motto. Read your flag.
Yeah, now all the New England states are pro-medical marijuana states, and we have Colorado and Washington that have legalized marijuana. So the federal government has tried to block it, but the states have revolted, basically. Yeah. And so medical marijuana is moving forward, and we do a lot of work with the drug policy reform movement. And one of the things that was astonishing to me to find out is that some of the recent polling that was done, now keep in mind that there's now millions of dollars and the most sophisticated political operatives working on marijuana legalization. There are some on the other side too, but the whole drug policy reform movement has moved forward incredibly. And so one of the findings was about why people voted for marijuana legalization. And you would think that the most important predictor of whether somebody is in favor of legalizing marijuana is if they smoke marijuana. You'd think that they wouldn't want to be a criminal. But that's not true. There's another factor that is more determinative of whether people are for marijuana legalization, and that's if people know a medical marijuana patient.
Really?
Yeah. So what that means is that we are bombarded by information. A lot of it we know we shouldn't trust, but when we have actual hard, direct information through word of mouth, through people we know that marijuana has been helpful to them, then they call into question the whole system of prohibition. So what we also
That's a great fact for you to have, because and at Hefter and all these institutions, because you're coming out with these studies. There's double-blind clinical data about the benefits of psilocybin, MDMA, things like that. And I've noticed it as well. It is a really powerful tool when talking to people who are entrenched with their belief systems. You say, hey, this was shown to have XYZ benefit without this negative effect that you think exists because of some propaganda machine many years ago.
Yeah, that actually led this idea of how do we change people's minds. You know, some of the things I learned at the Kennedy School and other people as well, that what we're trying to show is not that psychedelics are helpful to aging hippies, of which Charlie and I are representatives, but that they're helpful to the mainstream. We just did the first study of LSD-assisted psychotherapy in over 40 years in Switzerland, and it was for people who were anxious about end-of-life issues. Mm-hmm. And the most important factor, in addition to saying that it helped people with anxiety and there wasn't any drug-related serious adverse events, the most important thing to say about that particular study is that 11 out of the 12 subjects had never done LSD before. So all of us are going to face death. We're all somewhat, to varying degrees, anxious and uncertain about it. And so picking psychedelics for end of life is both humane and strategic from a broader political way. Working with veterans...
Even better, in my opinion, would be to get that done, knock that out earlier so you're not afraid of it your whole life.
Right.
But, at the end, better late than never.
You're totally right. But that gets us to this idea that we talked about earlier about psychedelics as rites of passage.
Yeah.
Because when they have been used that way, people do get a different sense of time and a different sense of death.
Absolutely.
And what it hopefully helps people to do is to appreciate that we're really, each of us, only here in our current human form for a very short time.
Yep.
And that rather than think about what life is going to be like in heaven or hell or with the flames or whatever, that we need to appreciate the brief moments that we have. And I think that's what the mystical experience often can do, is it can help people to lose a fear of death and become more motivated to change the life that we know consensually that we all share together. And I think working with firefighters and veterans, and now we might have our first police officer going through screening right now to be in our post-traumatic stress disorder study. So we're trying to show for the police that the work that we're doing is beneficial for them. And then there's a whole series of studies with psychedelics for the treatment of addiction. Now, addicts, again, are the other, and they're demonized often, but to show that a drug-assisted psychotherapy session, a psychedelic-assisted, can help people who have problems with drugs, shows that it's not the drug that's the inherently good or bad thing, it's how it's used. Mm-hmm. So I think we've developed a way to move forward with our research, and now that we're talking about an MDMA study with autistic adults who have social anxiety because of various difficulties understanding human emotions or relating to others, that opens up another area where many families are very concerned about their kids who have autism or adults with autism, that we're starting to break out again of the stereotypes of the hippies who did these drugs for recreational purposes. So I think the culture is ready if we're careful and also if we're patient, not to push it too fast.
I agree with that. All right, well, let's take a quick break here. I'm going to go use the bathroom, and then I think what I'd like to do from here is start getting into let's go medicine by medicine and talk about where the field stands and what some of the significant results that you guys have found, and of course start to go all the way, and then maybe come back to a little bit more. I want to touch a little bit more on some of the new scientific discoveries that are coming out and how that's kind of merging with some of the intelligence, and also go back to a little bit to what you talked about of why cultures go crazy and how this whole movement, if successful, how the ripple effect might take place and really make a change that could benefit the world in a larger way. So take a break and we'll be back for more action. In a second. So we're back here with the full team. On the break, we've been discussing some of the religious exemptions. And I think, Rick, you were going to go back into the first one, which is the Native American church and the ritualistic use of peyote.
Yeah, and so there's about 500,000 members of the Native American church that have legal permission from a U.S. Supreme Court case to use peyote as part of their religion. But the important point from the perspective of the federal government is that it was limited, and so it's the only time in American history where a religion has had a racial qualification.
Yeah, Charlie was saying they have to be 25% Native American in order to partake in in the church ritual.
Yeah, now that's from federal law. A lot of state laws don't hold that, but
And how do you justify that? I mean,
Well,
what do you have to show?
Well, there is no justification for that. How do you have a religion which you have to have a racial requirement? But I think the point is
and that's
that,
a Jew that's saying that, by the way.
I think from the perspective of the government trying to limit it, and I guess this helps explain why I've felt that the medical approach has the most potential, because ultimately we need both religious freedom and freedom from religion.
Yeah.
So that we should, all of us, have our fundamental human right to explore our own consciousness through whatever mechanisms we choose. And that for the legal system, the fundamental religious freedom touches too much on legalization. So that's why they've tried to say it's only for groups, and ideally groups where you require Indian blood, or groups where you are
So
part
what's
of this Brazilian religion.
Yeah. And the Brazilian religion, so for the Church of Native American, it's the Indian blood. That's the
Yeah.
obstacle.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
for the UDV, it's just their natural intrinsic hierarchical nature that's preventing people
Well-
from opening a, West Hollywood UDV,
Well, I-
Santa Monica UDV, Austin, Texas UDV.
Right,
Because
now
it'd be wildly popular.
Yeah.
Anybody from the UDV that wants to open a church in Austin, I can get you members.
No, it has
You
to
won't.
be-
You'll fill the pews. Let's just,
Yeah.
just say that.
It's very centralized in UDV. It's hierarchical, and there can be no new temples without the blessing of the central body, the governing body for the UDV. It's just a very, very strong centralized control.
And I think as we get, I still want to stick to the idea of kind of going one by one on all these things. But that to me is kind of a, proof and point of the fact that just because you're taking ayahuasca doesn't give you a global vision. Because it would seem like you would think, oh, these people are taking ayahuasca, that must mean that they know the benefit, and they're going to want the greatest amount of people to at least have access to it, have the free will and option to do it.
They know the benefit, but I think they're also concerned that if it becomes too popular and too many people gravitate towards it, it might jeopardize the legal protection they already have.
Right.
I think that's the concern.
Even though the Supreme Court did already rule unanimously in their
Right,
favor. I mean,
right.
that's pretty good backing. I mean,
Well,
you got the highest
right,
court
right,
in
right.
unanimous. They're never unanimous.
In this case, wasn't it interesting that, at least on this occasion, the Supreme Court's prioritize protection of freedom of religion rights over the enforcing the drug war, which I thought was a very interesting phenomenon.
Very interesting. Yeah. So let's go. We're already on the topic of ayahuasca. So let's go and kind of talk about a bit about the mechanism of action, which I think a lot of people are pretty familiar with. Obviously, you're combining a monoamine oxidase inhibitor
Right.
with active DMT.
Dimethyltryptamine. If you take dimethyltryptamine orally by itself, nothing happens because it's inactivated in the gut by the monoamine oxidase enzyme system. However, if you brew the plant containing the DMT with another plant containing harmala alkaloids, which have monoamine oxidase inhibiting action, that allows for, it prevents deactivation, allows for active absorption and entry into the central nervous system. And it's a very powerful activator of CNS activity.
And so there's a lot of kind of mysticism around the DMT molecule. What's your take as a researcher and clinician?
Oh, the spirit molecule?
The spirit molecule I'm referring to, yes, indeed.
Well, our friend Rick Doblin he's for years been talking about endogenous DMT, perhaps, playing a role in just conscious activity. My friend and colleague Jace Calloway from Finland had a theory that it's actually our endogenous DMT along with endogenous beta carbolines, which have MAOI activity, that allows that are secreted during sleep that explain
The dream
on a
state.
cellular level the dream state, which I think is quite fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And from the shaman's perspective, I think they definitely, at least in their mind, there's some association with that as well, as far as life, death, and the role that DMT can provide to getting
DMT
you
is
access
a
to those different
powerful,
levels.
powerful compound. When smoked or injected, it has virtually instantaneous, although albeit short-lived effects, altering consciousness, allowing individuals to access what they often report as a very profound realm of spiritual awareness. It ends fairly quickly, but can leave a lasting
Sure.
impact. With ayahuasca,
It's also
orally
what I've found one of the leading causes of tattoo creation
Oh,
that I've noticed. You see
DMT?
somebody with wild, man, I had this trip, I smoked this DMT, and I saw this thing, and it was amazing, and now it's here on my arm.
Was that true
It's
for
very
you?
frequently. It wasn't true for me. No, I got some other thing. Well, in a certain way, I have a rattlesnake with two tails on it.
You have the serpent,
Which was
sure.
the serpent, and certainly there's a lot of serpent imagery that you see on ayahuasca. The
Yeah.
serpent's constantly around that, and of course I read Narby's book and
Yeah.
found that.
Although I
compelling.
would say then that I'm still a little bit dubious that if you had a scientific experiment where people would be given in a double-blind manner, some would be given ayahuasca, some would be, and you can do ayahuasca in freeze-dried encapsulated preparations. That's how it's being researched in Spain. So if you gave people capsules, some would be ayahuasca, some would be psilocybin, some would be LSD. I really have my doubts as to whether there would be more visions of serpents in the ayahuasca group, but maybe. I won't just say for sure not, but I would like, before I would believe that these particular visions are associated with the molecules rather than with the cultural context and our understanding.
What do you make of what Claudio Naranjo said when he administered synthetic harmaline to subjects back in the 60s, I think in Europe, and he claims without giving them much information on the plants that harmaline is in, that his subjects reported serpent snake imagery.
Well, I think that's an important point of evidence. I have a lot of respect for Claudio Naranjo. We just republished his book, The Healing Journey,
Right.
which is one of the classics of psychedelic literature about his work with various psychedelics, MDA, ibogaine, and harmaline. And this was published, I think, originally around 1972, with work that was done in the late 60s. It's a beautiful book about the therapeutic approach. So I have a lot of respect for Claudio's approach.
It would be really interesting to see, because that would indicate some kind of cool thing, at least
Yeah.
hypothesize about what is these altered states that are being created.
The flip side is the indigenous people, when describing their experiences to early investigators, would talk about astral projection and their spirit flying through the air and visualizing ultra-modern cities. Now, how would indigenous people from the remote forests be aware of what a futuristic city might look like?
Yeah.
That's
Well,
also
I would like to
curious.
see that replicated in modern
Well, get to work.
scientific
Get to work
process.
then, Rick.
Right.
You got a lot of studies we'd like to see here. All right?
These are all
That's true.
anecdotal accounts. We
Sure.
need to rigorously explore.
Yeah, and I guess I should add here that we have limited resources, that the results of the studies that Charlie and I are doing, they're really collaborative efforts by thousands of people. MAPS has thousands of members who donate, some as little as $5 or $10, and others, substantially more. But that we're doing nonprofit research. That we are not able, at least as of yet, to get government funding.
Sure.
These drugs are all off patent, so there's no pharmaceutical interest, and the major foundations are still finding it too controversial. We had a meeting in England with the Wellcome Trust a couple of years ago. The Wellcome Trust has $20 billion in assets. They're the largest foundation in England. They're set up by the borough's Wellcome, by the pharmaceutical industry. They're interested in neuroscience. We met with them to talk about MDMA research for post-traumatic stress disorder, and they talked about it as a reputational risk. And I said, it's a reputational opportunity for you to get in, but they perceived it as a reputational risk. So
I can't see the pharmaceutical industry sponsoring this research, because where's the profit margin in a compound that might need to be administered on only one occasion?
And what's the profit loss from all of these different residual things that are approximating some kind of
Yeah.
cure.
So that gets back to-
SSRIs and whatever.
Well, they make their money on compounds that are administered daily for weeks, for months, for years.
Methadone, for example.
Yeah. So this question, there are so many interesting things we could do to psychedelics, but because we have limited resources.
Couldn't you tag on? There's some ayahuasca studies that are going on now, right? Couldn't you tag on just a questionnaire from about?
Well, there are no ayahuasca studies in the U.S.
Right.
No one has ever had a study approved in the U.S.
But you said you had some addictions. There was some addiction
That was
studies.
in Canada. So
Canada.
MAPS funded a study.
Gabor Mate did a study in Northwest Canada.
Gabor Mate had a great speech. I was really moved by what he had
Yeah.
to say. So talk to us about this investigation.
Okay,
in
so
Canada.
there's a group of people in British Columbia that have been quite interested in ayahuasca research, and what they felt would be the most appropriate patient group was people who had problems with addiction. And so the study is incredible because they used First Nations people, like Native Americans, who had their culture decimated and who have lots of problems with addiction. So the subjects were First Nations people. The shaman came from Peru, so we have sort of third world Peruvians coming with ayahuasca to British Columbia to work with First Nations people, mediated by Gabor Mate, who is a Western psychiatrist with an expertise in addiction treatment, and Philippe Lucas and others that were creating a scientific context around it with official institutional review board approval, supported by MAPS. And what they found was that there was a statistically significant reduction in problems with addiction in this group of people. Mm-hmm. And that what the implications are is that psychedelics, just the same way that LSD or psilocybin or other ibogaine can be helpful in the treatment of addiction, that ayahuasca can be useful for treating various maladies. Now, there's a
so how many patients were in the group, and was it
about
double
12.
blind or just
It was what was called an observational study.
Right.
So what that means is that it wasn't double blind.
Right.
It was.
I can't imagine the placebo tea that you have to make.
Well, that's a whole other
That
complicated scientific issue that we face in all of our studies.
How dare you make a placebo tea that has no effects, that tastes like ayahuasca?
Yeah, I mean, what we're leaning towards is what's called dose response.
Yeah.
Where the placebo is actually a low dose of ayahuasca, where everybody gets it, but you try to show that the people that had the full dose do better than the
when
others.
you treat alcoholism or drug addiction, the ultimate outcome measure is obvious. It's establishing and maintaining sobriety. And interestingly, going back to the late 50s and into the 60s, a clinical area that showed some of the greatest promise with the psychedelic treatment model was the treatment of alcoholism. An area notorious for lack of responsivity to conventional treatments. We still struggle with chronic alcoholics. We still have very limited tools within medicine to utilize with people coming in with serious alcohol abuse. Whereas, the native peoples utilizing peyote ritual, or the South Americans, and many of the Brazilians I interviewed for our study of ayahuasca were former alcoholics and drug addicts who had a profound transformation and established, maintained sobriety since then. So it's one of the most promising clinical areas to engage in large part because the cost to individuals and society are enormous, and because even to this point we have very limited conventional treatments that have proven efficacy.
Sure.
Yeah, I think there's two parts. One is that with all of the psychedelics, that they sort of remove people's defenses from what they've been suppressing. And that's where the challenge is to surrender to that. But the classic hallmark of addiction is that people are denial, that they're not paying attention to what they're doing to themselves and others. So that comes to the surface under the influence of psychedelics, ayahuasca or others. And then at the same time, people who are addicted often feel isolated and alone and not connected to the world or to others. And that you can get that sense of connection with the psychedelics, so that there's the spiritual element and then there's this psychological emergence of repressed material, and together in a supportive way. that can be really helpful. Now there is
The ayahuasca too has a very physically cleansing,
Yeah.
and same with the iboga as well. You
Yeah.
feel very, it almost like it resets,
Yeah,
some of
yeah.
your organ systems. I don't know what the actual effects on your liver and body, but I'll tell you, you feel great
Yeah.
when you're
Well,
finished.
well,
not
not-
only mentally, spirit, because you're psychically, but physically. as
not,
well.
not almost. I'm saying that ibogaine is used to help people go through withdrawal to opiates.
Yep.
And they are reset. And that's actually one of the dangers too. Is sometimes people who relapse take amounts of opiates that they had built up a tolerance to, and then they can actually die. And there are cases of people that have tried iboga for the treatment of addiction and then re-administer opiates and do it at doses that they
Well,
used to do
I definitely
before.
want to chat about iboga, but is there anything else, just to finish on ayahuasca, is
Yeah.
there anything else that ayahuasca is currently being used in clinical
Yeah,
research besides addiction?
Yeah, so let me say though that there is this kind of challenge within the movement, because there are some people who say that ayahuasca comes from a religious tradition and that it's sacrilege to take it out of that religious tradition into a scientific context or even into a therapeutic context. So after the study was done in British Columbia and the results were made public, and Gabor Mate spoke about to the media about the success of this treatment, Health Canada came to him and said that he had to stop doing that, that this was a drug, that they were using it in a therapeutic context, and that Health Canada would need to give permission for research. And so that if he were to continue doing this, his license would be taken away and he would be put in jail. So I found a donor who was willing to pay for the manufacture of freeze-dried encapsulated ayahuasca, which would be a standardized preparation
Sure.
that Health Canada would accept. The Peruvian shaman refused to work with it because it wasn't their traditional brew. It was
right.
somehow modified and desacralized in a way.
But to do a research study, it's of great value to have standardization
Sure.
of the compound you're administering. And there's a research psychologist in Barcelona, Spain, Jordi Riba, who for 15 years has conducted a series of studies with ayahuasca using the freeze-dried ayahuasca, because this allows for consistency of the concentration of
regulation,
alkaloids in each dose they receive.
That makes sense. And you don't even have, the ayahuasca is great when you actually use the vine and the leaf as they prepare, but
Yeah.
you could get around that another way. You could use Syrian rue and
Yeah.
Right.
some other
Right.
compound
Yeah.
high containing
Right, and those
Yeah.
pharmahuascas, synthetic
Pharmahuasca, yeah.
DMT along with synthetic harmine. But
yeah. But it's
Yeah.
it's nice to stick with the plants for sure when you can.
Well, okay. Let me. Why do you say that? Tell me what is.
Well, I've
your-
noticed. I've noticed in running a nutritional supplement company, there's different things that you can do. You can either take an extract of a plant, and let's say we're targeting huperzine, right? You can either take the huperzine, which has been drawn out of the Huperzia serrata, and then blown back on top of a compound, an inert compound, or maybe some dried leaf material, and take that. And you can take the same amount that you would take in a full spectrum dose, right? And you're going to have a similar but differing effect. And I've noticed this on down the line from standardized nutritionals that you're trying to get an effect from. The effect can be very acute, and from the standardized approach where they draw out just that one marker. However, there's other things that come into play that you feel from a full spectrum extract, and you can scientifically verify that there's huperzine B, there's huperzine C,
Yes.
there's other things that come from that I think have come along with that one marker that you maybe
yes,
look
yes.
look
I
at
agree.
medical marijuana,
Yeah.
and isolating delta 9 THC is very different than medical marijuana. And isolated delta 9 THC as Marinol or whatever is also reported to have some very unpleasant side effects: excessive sedation, lack of mental clarity. But the marijuana plant contains some 60-odd alkaloids,
including CBD, which is a
CBD,
natural
which seems to have an
anxiolytic.
enormous role in the therapeutic
Yeah.
capacity of marijuana.
Yeah, so I totally agree with that. I thought you were saying that if you have the same molecule, if you get it from a plant or if you make it synthetically, somehow or other, it's better to go from the plant.
Right. I think you would just miss some of the little subtle things that have come along, that ride along with it when you have a full plant extract.
Well,
I'm sure.
I believe, I agree on the
yeah.
full plant extracts for sure.
Move my car.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll
All right, so I'll continue a bit then on the ayahuasca.
Yeah.
Which is that there is this sort of tension of various people from religious traditions saying that having the goal being therapeutic is inappropriate, and that the therapy comes along as a side effect, you could say, of the proper religious approach.
Come in.
Which is in their particular religious framework.
Sure.
So I think that there is a lot to be said for the work that Jordi Riba is doing with freeze-dried encapsulated ayahuasca, and that is a whole plant, you could say, extract. And so there's been an enormous amount of neuroscience research.
There's also some issue with, I've noticed even in dose preparations in the indigenous. Come on in. Dose preparations in an indigenous setting, from one year to the next, maybe based on the harvest of the plants or whatever.
Yeah.
The brew was different.
Yeah.
Just the experience across the board from everybody in the group from one year to the other. The first year, people were having really dramatic visual experiences. The next year, it was more internal and cleansing, and somehow the ratio is different. So having standardization makes some sense, because you know what you're going to get into.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely.
I'm sorry, who will be saying?
Yes, we're getting some snacks here. Don't mind us here on the podcast. We need snacks too. Take your opportunity to get some snacks.
Mediterranean trio, some chicken croquetas, and two it's very perfect.
Okay.
Enjoy.
That sounds
Have a
good.
great day.
Thanks.
If you need anything, feel free to give us a call. Do you still want to keep that there, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we can remove this tray and then maybe we'll put this stuff on the table.
You want it on the table?
What's our time? 36. So,
Okay, so in terms of ayahuasca, there are some interesting projects going on in San Francisco where some people have offered and have taken numerous veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder to Peru and then tried to treat their post-traumatic stress disorder with ayahuasca. And they've gotten some good results, but it's also something where their model is different from our model with MDMA is to provide people with intensive psychotherapeutic support. Their model was more, here's the ayahuasca, go heal yourself.
right.
And so I think that can work, but that's also more challenging and more difficult.
It seems like, with all these medicines, it's almost like they're all powerful tools, and you could use a wrench to hammer a nail, if that's your goal, or you could use some of these tools will get the job done for a lot of different applications. But for me, with my experience with them, there seems to be different ones that are particularly good at certain things.
Yeah.
And I think you've really identified that with the MDMA for PTSD. While these other things may work and make some progress,
Right.
that's the right tool for that job. And I kind of feel, when I did my iboga experience, I could see how that could be the best tool for the addiction model as well.
Yeah.
Because to me, the ayahuasca, it was almost like I felt like I was accessing information abroad from another source, and it was coming, it was splashing against my perception and creating these fireworks of visions and colors and things that were happening. Except for that one experience I had where I got really dropped into some lucid clarity and the vision stopped. But with iboga, it was like myself talking to myself. It was like a higher, better, smarter Aubrey telling this Aubrey, like, hey, Aubrey, this is what's up. This is where, things aren't quite right. This is where you could make some improvements. And just, in a good-natured way, was literally telling myself in my own voice about all of my own patterns and issues in my life. And I could see how that could be highly effective in an addiction
Well,
setting.
not only that, though, that what we're really trying to talk about is psychedelic medicine.
Yeah.
And so it may be that as people go through a healing process for addiction or for other things, that they sequenced through a series of different psychedelics as
Yeah.
well. So there's work that's been done in a sort of underground, unofficial way with people who are dying, who are anxious about dying. And often there's a series of psychedelic experiences, beginning with MDMA, to help people in a more gentle way to open up, and then often moving to the more classic psychedelics, which are more challenging but tend to be more spiritual in certain ways. MDMA is more relational in this world, and then often ending near the end of life with MDMA, where I've seen it where somebody was just a few days away from dying, they were on heavy narcotics for the pain, and then the MDMA had the effect of reducing the pain even more so than the narcotics, but then waking people up, so that they weren't so tranquilized. So I think that...
Which is not only important, if people think, oh, they're going to die anyways. Well, the impact that can have on the person in that transition, can be extremely significant. I mean, we don't know exactly what happens on the other side, but for those of us in this field, we have a strong inclination that there's something else besides the box that we're going to be experiencing.
Well,
So
I don't
there's
know
that,
about
and there's
I mean,
also...
that's an interesting point, but I think that we experiencing it is a little bit logically confusing, because I think after we die, there is no us. We are dissolved.
We don't know.
We don't know. But
We don't know.
just-
But my point of that
Yeah.
was that it's not only going to affect that person, it's going to affect everybody around them
Yes,
as well.
exactly.
Their whole family. Being able to have that moment of clarity and connection
Yeah.
can heal decades later of pain that
Yeah.
you would have had
Yeah.
to deal with. So it's not only therapy for the person who's dying, it's therapy for everybody else around that person.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a woman, Marilyn Howell, who's written a book that MAPS has published, Honor Thy Daughter. And it's about the underground treatment of her daughter as she was dying of cancer with this series of psychedelics. And she ended
So what
up,
was the progression that they used, if you can recall it?
Yeah. They used an initial 2 experiences with MDMA. Then they switched to mushrooms. Then they switched to LSD, but the LSD was a little bit more challenging than the woman who was dying was ready for. So then they supplemented it with MDMA. So an MDMA LSD combination, and then even that was resisted. And then after like 6-7 hours, they added marijuana, and that opened the floodgates.
Really?
Yeah, and then it went on for many hours more, and then they went back several days before she died to do MDMA with her mother and father there, and that was just a fantastic emergence from the tragedy of a young woman dying, the only child without children, to a point where she said how beautiful it was to be able to die with her mother and father there with her. And then several days later, as she was actually dying, she was administered MDMA, which caused her to relax and to have a more peaceful death.
Yeah.
So I think that finding and matching the psychedelic to the clinical condition to the particular kind of person too, that's something that is highly sophisticated, and that's something that we will be getting towards eventually, and that's what's happening now in modern...
And then even if it's not a clinical condition, let's just say, I had a vision of almost a replacement for a new type of church, church of experience that you would call it, where your pastor, you'd be able to go in and talk about your problems and see what's up, and he would be able to dial in whatever he thought might be the best. Sure, maybe it was, MDMA would really open your heart, allow you to see through some of this trauma. Or he would say, you seem to have some addictive psychological traits. I think a session with iboga would be preferable for you. Meet you here next Sunday, and be able to dial in even for non-clinical conditions, but for everybody.
Well, I think that our focus on pathology, our focus, much of this discussion has been about psychedelics for particular disorders. That's more of a strategic decision about our culture providing legal context for scientific research and for the development of medicines. I think the idea of psychedelics as tools for otherwise healthy people throughout their lifespan, not just for rites of passage in their teenage years, or
Sure.
for working on relationships, when they're older and trying to figure out who to be in love with.
Yeah.
That then later for midlife crisis, and then later as people are preparing to die. So I think this idea that what we're ultimately going for is a society that has integrated and mainstreamed the access to a range of states of consciousness from a range of substances for people who are otherwise healthy and normal,
Yeah.
both in religious context, medical context, or just personal growth. And I think that's the end state that we'd like to see. But I think for strategic reasons, we need to work within a medical
I agree.
context.
I think that's the only way to ultimately get there. This is
Yeah.
the step.
Yeah.
This is the the stone on the pond that you have to cross before you can ultimately
Yeah,
get
and I think
beyond it.
within the next 20 years, there's a real good chance that we will see that. I mean, we're predicting that MDMA can become a prescription medicine for post-traumatic stress disorder within about 10 years. After people are thinking about psilocybin for end of life, maybe even faster than that.
And you never know, too. At a certain point, with these studies coming out, the critical mass of awareness and
Yeah.
acceptance, because you publish this
Yeah.
data.
Yeah.
At the point
Yeah.
that you're in full phase 2 or phase 3 before the new drug application,
Yeah.
it might be like, all right, come on. Everybody may just
Yeah.
wake up and this could happen faster. Or
Yeah.
maybe you have to take it all the way to the bitter end and
Yeah.
get that NDA,
Yeah, or we take it, if we get the new drug approval, and then it takes another 10, 20, 30 years to really roll it out in society, the same way I was describing with the hospice movement. The first one, 30 years later, there was one in every town, but
Maybe,
it took 30 years.
but now the proliferation of information is so good that people are
yeah.
going to Google it and be like, "Yeah, I want that. Look
Yeah,
at the
yeah.
results of that. That one
Yeah,
looked good."
yeah.
So I think
It
it'll
could
come
be faster.
faster than it
Yeah.
used to.
So to get back to what you were wanting to do, which was drug by drug. So with ayahuasca, there's a fellow, Jacques Mabit in Peru, that's doing research with ayahuasca in the treatment of addiction. He does a different approach in the sense that it's a residential program lasting months and uses ayahuasca as well as a whole host of other herbal medicines.
A lot of purgatives.
A lot of purgatives and
As if ayahuasca wasn't a strong enough purgative. You needed more? How
Yeah.
rude. How
He,
rude.
he preps people with purgative plants, long before they
Well, there is some kind of
ayahuasca.
tradition of smoking a lot of that tobacco till you
yeah.
purge from that before you go into a session.
Yeah, and that's
Seems
what
makes some
worked for
sense.
you, having it blown out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's not that much clinical research with ayahuasca. The only clinical research in the world is taking place in Barcelona with Jordi Riba and his team.
Mm-hmm.
The observational research that we've described is over now, and because Health Canada came and cracked down, there's no other efforts going on there.
Some, I think well-designed ayahuasca research, but back in the 90s and the early 2000s.
Well, I thought the study that you did that was particularly important, I thought, and again, these are sort of comparisons. You weren't actually for the study that I thought was particularly important. You mentioned it earlier about the adolescents who had grown up in ayahuasca cultures,
Right.
And how did they
Some
compare?
had been exposed in utero.
Right.
Some of their mothers had taken small doses of ayahuasca during labor and delivery. And these are very high-functioning kids, and we studied their neuropsychological function and took extensive history, psychiatric interviews.
Wow. Talk about
They
a
were-
powerful experience having birth while on ayahuasca.
Yeah, for the mother and the child.
Yeah.
I've been present when babies have been baptized with eyedropperfuls of ayahuasca.
Wow.
And then generally in UDV, kids do not participate in ceremonies until they hit puberty, and then it's their choice. They have the option of accompanying their parents to ceremonies and being administered initially at least very modest dosages.
Yeah, I was in a wedding ceremony in a Native American church peyote context. So it was an all-night ceremony, and there was one of the men who was there participating brought his 9-year-old son. And the 9-year-old son took small amounts of peyote, but spent the whole night up with everybody.
That's great.
So I think the age limits that we have in our culture are particularly destructive and not helpful. And I say that as a
Wait a
father.
minute, you mean all the alcohol prohibition hasn't stopped teens from drinking?
Well, I have 3 teenage kids right now, so I'm at the maximum chaos and
Right.
rebellion phase of
it's-
3
It's
teenagers.
the forbidden fruit. It makes it all the more.
Indeed.
Yeah,
I
14,
think
17,
you can,
and
you can just
18.
look at the statistics. American teens drink more than anybody.
Huh.
You know,
Yeah.
and I've seen some statistics that
Yeah.
look like that.
Well, the binge alcohol drinking.
Sure, because
by
you
young
get it, because
people
you
is
get it
enormous.
finally, and then you
Yeah.
go crazy.
Yeah. So I think with ayahuasca, there could be a lot more scientific research than there is right now.
Sure.
And I think the issue is both will traditional healers be willing to work with freeze-dried encapsulated ayahuasca? The answer generally seems to be no. And then the other part of this, again, is who is funding this research? And where does the money come from? And so trying to make... I have actually been asked not to do much in terms of developing ayahuasca into a medicine out of respect for its spiritual use.
Uh-huh.
And so that's something that I've considered a lot.
Well, I think the MDMA choice is a good one because there are no places in the world where that's legal.
Right.
You know, like if you really want to do ayahuasca, you can still go to Peru
Yeah.
or go to
Yeah.
Brazil. I mean, it's a little expensive. And if you
Yeah.
want to do iboga, you can go to the UK, you can go to Canada, you can go to Mexico.
Yeah.
These are very powerful medicines, but
Yeah.
there is an outlet, there is an option. You know, I'm able to take it and talk about it and tell people because the context where I did it was fully legal, and that was
Yeah.
great. You don't have to worry about anything. So yes, it's unfortunate that it's expensive. It's going to preclude a lot of people from getting the benefits, but something like MDMA is, as far as I'm aware, it's not legal anywhere.
No, that's the success of the United States in exporting our drug policy through the international treaty organizations, so that there is no place in the world where MDMA is legal. And it's only legal now in the context of research.
Yeah.
And right now we have finished 2 studies, one in the United States and one in Switzerland for MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder with outstanding results. And we have additional studies actively underway right now in Israel, in Boulder, Colorado, and in Charleston, South Carolina, the one with veterans, firefighters, and police officers. We're soon to start a study in Canada for post-traumatic stress disorder. And these are all what are called phase 2 studies. And these are pilot studies trying to understand, from a scientific perspective, a series of methodological questions that prepare you to do the definitive phase 3 studies,
Right.
which we hope will start in about 3 years.
So let's dig into MDMA because I think that's something that's got a lot of momentum and certainly an area of expertise for both of you guys. So let's talk about first. There was a big myth about the negative effects of this, that one dose is going to fry your brain. So let's talk about a little bit about the mechanism of action, what it's doing to release the neurochemicals, and then what is actually happening and what the negative effects, if any, there are in real life and not in hyperbole.
Well, it's a powerful releaser of serotonin, and about 15, 18 years ago, there was a lot of concern raised about the potential to cause so-called neurotoxicity in the serotonergic system. They identified that in animal models or animals, they injected very, very high dosages of the drug, that once they sacrificed the animal and examined the brain, there was some degeneration of peripheral axons. However, the cell bodies were spared. There has never been any good data substantiating that a neurotoxic process occurs in humans, and in fact we're hardly hearing about neurotoxicity any longer, in large part because of a scandal that occurred in the neurotoxicity field. In, I think, 2002, the journal Science, maybe the most prestigious journal in the world, published to high media attention a study looking at the brains of monkeys that had been administered, so they said, with high dosages of MDMA.
Whoops, we put a little methamphetamines in
Well,
there.
yeah, you're jumping ahead, but they reported damage to the dopamine system. So the implication there is that all of these people who are using MDMA will ultimately be very vulnerable for Parkinson's disease. But a year later, in the same journal, in a back page, a little paragraph, there was a retraction that basically said, whoops, it wasn't MDMA that was administered, rather it was methamphetamine. Now the newspapers
They both start with M. That's pretty good for science, you know.
They have very different effects clinically and
Obviously,
neurophysiologically, but ever since, and there's very minimal media coverage of that retraction, and in fact that episode was featured in a book written by a science writer named Simon LeVay. The book was called When Science Goes Wrong, the 10 greatest fiascos in the history of science, and this episode weighed in at number 4. And ever since, the neurotoxicity issue seems to have more or less vanished.
You talk, but it vanished maybe for your circle.
Right.
But you talk to someone who heard that and hasn't heard anything else about it. It still persists.
So we have to
that's still
distinguish
doing damage today.
between an MDMA treatment model where the drug might be utilized on only one occasion versus excessive recreational use, where some individuals are predisposed to using quite a bit of whatever they get involved with.
And
then there's a lot of drug substitution. There's a lot of so-called ecstasy or so-called Molly, which is presumed to be MDMA, but on analysis it turns out to be very different drugs, some of which are rather innocuous, like Benadryl or aspirin, and some of which are very dangerous and potentially lethal, like paramethoxyamphetamine or PMA, the most potent amphetamine known. And in fact, there have been a number of so-called ecstasy deaths when they reported the analysis of the drug used turned out not to be MDMA, but rather PMA. So MDMA has garnered a very negative reputation, to some degree unfairly, I think, because of this drug substitution. But also it is important for people to realize that too much of a good thing is not necessarily good for you. Yeah, it could be problematic. So in moderation would be the approach to take with this and other compounds.
I think that the focus on neurotoxicity in terms of our discussion is really important, because I think the obligation that we have, those of us who are advocating for the medical use, is that we have to be the experts on both the benefits and the risks. And that the government, the drug control portions, the prohibition portions of the government and their private supporters sort of forfeited their credibility by denying the benefits and exaggerating the risks. And we have to be very careful not to do the opposite of exaggerating the benefits and denying the risks. So the first hint of MDMA neurotoxicity came in 1985. And it was Dr. George Riccardi at the University of Chicago doing work in rats with MDA, not with MDMA. And I heard about that when I was in Geneva, Switzerland, lobbying the WHO to try to slow down their attempted criminalization of MDMA and to try to get them to endorse the therapeutic use. And I heard from Dr. Bob Schuster, who was the PhD advisor for George Riccardi, that there was this particular concern about MDMA affecting serotonin, and he felt that it was likely to be mild, not that significant. He felt MDMA should be available as a prescription medicine. So then the Phil Donahue show in '85, they wanted to do an MDMA story, and I suggested that Bob Schuster be on the show because he had these reasonable views. Also on the same show was a fellow named Gene Hayslip from the DEA, And so during the discussion, Bob Schuster mentioned this study. He didn't mention it in any alarming way, but he said that there was some evidence from MDA in rats. And Gene Haslip from DEA realized that this was a reason that they could use to emergency criminalize MDMA. And so we were already engaged in DEA administrative law judge hearings that we were winning in the media about the therapeutic use. And so MDMA was criminalized on an emergency basis. So, and ironically, that itself was illegal. The DEA did not have the power to do emergency scheduling. The Department of Justice, the Attorney General had, but it never subdelegated it down to the DEA. So neurotoxicity was part of this story from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And so I felt that it was our obligation, and MAPS was started in '86, to try to really understand what the risks were. So I purchased the first monkeys for George Riccardi. I know a lot of people are not that sympathetic to animal research, and we do it only when necessary and in
Well,
a very
it's a little
limited
different
way.
giving monkeys MDMA versus giving monkeys.
Oh, but then they're sacrificed.
Well, yeah, then they're
At least they got to have
sacrificed
some fun before
and
that.
autopsied. So I purchased the first monkeys for George Riccardi, and he found what was called the no effect level, which is it was 2.5 milligrams per kilogram. Again, not given orally, but directly into the stomach, and given every 2 weeks for 4 months for 8 times. And so there was no effect on the serotonin system from 2.5 milligrams
That's
per
still,
kilogram.
relatively speaking, that's a fairly high dose.
Yeah.
Administered repeatedly.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and he refused to publish that. Actually, he published the 5 milligram per kilogram, where he saw some basic minor effects on reduction of serotonin nerve terminals. So
So
then,
it was having when you say no effect dose, you're saying no negative effect dose
well, no effect on serotonin.
on the serotonin.
On no
But the
long-term effect
monkeys
on
were
serotonin.
behaving in peculiar ways, I presume.
Well, actually, it turns out that it depends on the dose. Sometimes at a lower doses, the monkeys actually are more social. And
Yeah.
this was also done with dogs as well. And so I then moved on to work with George and provided the first humans. So this is in the late 80s, where there was just the beginning of, there was no real brain scan stuff.
This is how Rick and I met, actually. The same group had published a study in human subjects where they administered a test called the L-tryptophan challenge test, which was an indirect measure of serotonin function, and they claimed that they found abnormal results in MDMA exposed users compared to normal control volunteers. And it was published in a very prominent journal. I wrote a letter to the editor critiquing much of the methodology. And a few weeks after my letter to the editor was published, I got a call from someone introducing himself as Rick Doblin. I never heard of Rick Doblin. This was in the late 80s. And he said that Sasha Shulgin had referred him to my letter, and he wanted to meet with me. And he said, the flaws you're reporting on in that study of the L-tryptophan challenge test, you don't know the least of it. So he came and visited me and told me that the study was far more flawed than I even imagined. What the study did not mention was that the subjects had been selected from subjects in a previous study at Stanford University where they did spinal taps to look at the cerebrospinal fluid metabolite of serotonin, and they selected the people from the lower end of the spectrum of CSF serotonin metabolite levels for the L-tryptophan challenge test. So, I mean, you can do a study like that, but in your methodology, you have to explain that you have a selection bias.
You have a serotonin challenge.
So that's how we met.
Yeah, because
around
I
89
felt,
or 90.
I felt that
So
I had
is there like a conspiracy kind of going on here, or is this just bad science?
Well, it's certainly bad science, and it's also, look, to get funding is not an easy task, but if you come up with some approaches which will perhaps reliably identify presumed dangers of drugs that are considered pariah taboo drugs, you'll have a much easier time getting funding and launching your research career than if you would come up with negative data or even data pointing to therapeutic potentials. That is considered a career killer right there.
So I hate to rush this conversation along, but we may run out of time here, even in the conference. So
with MDMA, so I was the first one that got a spinal tap, and then I was able to volunteer, bring a whole lot of other people too. And so I think that we have done our best to try to understand the risks, and I think that we have on our website. It's called the Investigator's Brochure. There's over 3,000 papers on MDMA. We've summarized all of them. We've done a risk-benefit analysis, and it's our view that in a clinical setting with pure MDMA, roughly in the range of 125 milligrams, that there is no evidence that we've been able to gather of harm. We've done neurocognitive tests before and after, and showed actually slight increases, not declines. So I think that in a therapeutic context, the risk-benefit ratio is favorable, and that's what we've been able to.
So we've established the risk. So what I wanted to jump forward to is the benefit.
Okay.
And so that is, in releasing a lot of these neurochemicals, you're getting to states that have very beneficial mindsets for individuals. And you just mentioned even the oxytocin, which is one of the compounds released. And you get that when you hug somebody, right?
Right.
Isn't that when
It's
that's
the
released?
bonding hormone.
And when women are nursing.
Yeah.
It's been demonstrated to secretion of endogenous oxytocin increases with following administration of MDMA. So there might be a neuroendocrine explanation for some of the potential therapeutic action of MDMA.
So MDMA reduces activity in the left amygdala, which is a fear processing center of the brain. It enhances activity in the frontal cortex, which is where people do the put things in context. And then it also stimulates oxytocin and prolactin. And so that suggests that it could be especially helpful for post-traumatic stress disorder or for difficult emotions. MDMA is terrific for relationships. That's why it's so popular for emotional relationships.
Sure.
But
or your relationship to the world at large.
Yeah.
I've because of some of the risks and the impurities and issues. Me just tending not to like to do things that are illegal anymore. I don't do it. But I remember, I haven't ever talked about this, but my first experience with MDMA was in Australia, and I was away on a semester abroad in Australia, and a girl I met there at the time gave me some to try. And I remember walking around the streets of Brisbane and thinking, wow, look at all these people. Like I saw and I cared for strangers, just random strangers. And that was... Obviously, I cared for her a lot too, but just even people, like I saw a girl crying across the way, and I was like, oh, that's really unfortunate for her. I wish she could see how beautiful things are. Yeah. And people who are angry or frustrated, I saw the whole world in a different way, and I felt connected to the rest of the world, and that was therapy in itself that I've, it fades, but once you establish that, you don't tend to forget it.
MDMA appears to have a unique facility to allow people to experience states of empathy. In fact, Ralph Metzner suggested that that it be considered that class of compound be considered empathogens, which I think is
it's a good term
for it.
Yeah. However, as we talked before, having improving relationships or having a difficult relationship is not a disease.
Yeah.
So that's why there's no research there.
But
that is one of the benefits. We did a study briefly at Harvard for MDMA for cancer patients with anxiety, and found in the few people that were treated that it had, substantial positive benefits. But mostly the research is in post-traumatic stress disorder, and then the new study that Charlie and I and Alicia Danforth are going to be starting with MDMA for autistic adults with social anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Targeting the social anxiety.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that there are other potential uses of MDMA, but in terms of focusing strategically on where we get the most benefit, those are the only areas of MDMA that's being researched.
Well, you gotta focus your targets and then get it approved, and then the off-label use can
Yes.
accommodate that with a lot of forward
We're
thinking.
working our
information.
way through the regulatory system. So far, so good. Where we're bumping up against the biggest obstacle, though, is accessing sufficient funding. That's a chronic issue, and for this particular study, it's the biggest stumbling block right now in terms of anticipating a startup time.
All right, so that brings us to the point. If you're listening to this, you want to contribute to the cause, go to maps.org and donate a little bit, donate a lot, or if you know somebody who might be sympathetic, get them to listen to a podcast, mine or Joe's. I mean, you had a great interview with Joe Rogan on Joe Rogan Experience, or do the research, find it out, and because this is, in my mind, one of the frontiers that could really make a positive change, not just in individuals, but in the collective. And, I certainly applaud the work you're doing. So to bring that out to the broader approach, let's fast forward, 30 years, everything's legal. What does this world look like? How do you think this could integrate into this future society?
Well, I think that if we put in our mind hospice centers or even kidney dialysis centers, I think there will be psychedelic treatment centers, and they'll be in every city in the world. Mm-hmm. And that people will be able to go to therapists, psychiatrists that have specialized training, and they will be able to have these experiences in a legal context, not just for illnesses, but also for personal growth, if we're talking 30
Sure.
years from now. I think we will probably have a society where access to altered states through drugs has been legitimized. And I think one of our projects in terms of building a post-prohibition world is to recognize that in these rites of passage that people are creating at festivals, that there are going to be a lot of problems, that just legalizing drugs doesn't end drug problems. It just gives you a different approach towards dealing with them. And so what we've tried to demonstrate in some of the more high-profile events, like Burning Man, like Boom Festival in Portugal, and Vision in Costa Rica, Africa Burn in South Africa, and others, is what we're calling psychedelic harm reduction. Mm-hmm. So that people who, particularly younger people who go out to party with psychedelics, I think often don't have the proper understanding that you can't just slice off the positive side of these things.
Sure.
That difficult issues may come up and you may end up needing to deal with them. And when you run from them, they come after you, as you said. So what we've created is teams of experienced therapists, medical professionals, and volunteers that have created special places for people to go at festivals when they're having a difficult psychedelic experience. And they're then supported through their experience to the extent that they want to. Right. So that, and then they're free to go back to the festival. And we found that in these events, the police tend to be very sympathetic and not, in Boom in Portugal, it's the world example of psychedelic harm reduction because drugs are decriminalized, all drugs. And so the festival has
Powerful cultural.
25, 30,000 people. They have on-site thin layer chromatography, high-tech drug testing to identify which of these pills are actually, what do they actually contain. Mm-hmm. Then they have PowerPoint presentations that broadcast them to everybody that's there. They have, at Boom it's called Cosmic Care. At Burning Man we call it the Zendo Project. We just had an Indiegogo campaign to raise money for our Zendo project, and we had a goal of 10,000, and we've already got 12,500. But I think the idea is in the future, it's not like these drugs are without risk, and I think people have to approach them with caution and really be willing to open up to whatever range of experiences that comes up. And so I think we will be able, though, to... Charlie talked about the PMA that's caused a lot of people to die from adulterated ecstasy pills that are not really MDMA. So that should be eliminated in a post-prohibition world. There'll be pure drugs, there'll be known quantity, there will be harm reduction approaches that are widespread and not make festival owners vulnerable. We have an anti-rave act that was designed. Our drug policy is a harm maximization policy designed to scare people away from doing things. And it penalizes the users and makes them worse off.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem really to scare that many people off from it either.
Well, because people have a good sense of bullshit, know, and they call bullshit on it. You know, if they were actually honest and people got to trust the sources, like the Zendo project, people in there, they probably get trusted because, they're not feeding them a bunch of bullshit. And that's what I think. There's a reckoning right now going on across multiple governmental levels in multiple countries where people are calling bullshit, saying, no, that's not true. And we know about it, in America to a great extent, but we just don't care quite enough yet. We know there's a lot of bullshit afoot, but we're like, that's exhausting. Just trying to think about it. Let me just go on with my day-to-day life. But I think the trend is in that favor of being able to discard that bad information and the proliferation of information of the internet and social media.
Yeah, your podcasts are great for getting information out.
It all makes, it all contributes to the puzzle, and getting that awareness shifted. Now there's going to be resistance, of course, to all of this on every step. The more success, the more a small group will come out against it. But
so I agree with Rick. Over time, we'd like to see more emphasis on harm reduction, maximization of health and safety. But there's a whole other element here, which is I've noted particularly with ayahuasca use. It appears to facilitate in people who've tried it greater awareness and sensitivity to what's going on in the environment. It allows them to connect with nature and allows them to be more aware and more prone to speaking up about the harms inflicted on the natural world and the risk it puts human civilization at.
And I think one of the reasons why it does that is it removes that separation that we feel from nature.
Yeah,
right.
It's all of a sudden, oh, wait a minute, I'm a part of this whole system here.
Nature, I think we've been, we get conditioned to seeing it just as a backdrop, just as, the scenery, whichever way. But these compounds facilitate an awareness of, oh my God, nature is alive.
Yeah, and I'm part of it.
And I'm part of it. And I depend upon its health and well-being for my health and well-being.
Indeed.
And my children's health and well-being.
Indeed.
And their children.
Well, thank you to you both on behalf of the world for the research that you're doing. I don't speak for the world often, but in this case, I feel comfortable thanking you on behalf of the world. And thanks for doing this podcast, of course. It's been a real pleasure to get to know you guys and have this conversation and put it out. So thanks again. And how can they get a hold of you guys? Either, you have all your URLs, maps.org, social media. And
yeah, we're on Twitter, on Facebook. Ask Maps at maps.org if they have any questions. Just email us. We have staff that monitors our email address, and we try to respond to everybody. Sometimes not right away, but we try to respond to everybody.
Great.
And everybody's questions are important, and we'll do our best to respond to them. And we have an enormous amount of information on the website
Great.
as well.
In addition to my involvement with Rick and with MAPS, I'm also part of the Hefter Research Institute. I'm on the board of Hefter.
Doing a lot of research with psilocybin. We didn't get to touch too much on that, but
we did a
another
psilocybin
time.
end of life site. We'll do that another time.
Yep.
But Hefter is doing a lot of really good work. You can access Hefter's activities on www.hefter.org.
Yeah, there's also the Beckley Foundation in England, and
She gave a great speech too.
yeah, Amanda, she's
She's a little fired up still. I like that.
yeah, yeah.
She's a little mad.
yeah, she's terrific.
She wields some influence in a very good way.
Yeah, and she's more interested in the sort of basic neuroscience of how LSD, and she's particularly interested in LSD and how it works in the brain.
And also policy.
And policy. I think what's really good about Amanda is that she's been understanding the link between the scientific research and the drug policy reform and how that's necessary. And then there's also the Council on Spiritual Practices, which has
Bob
helped
Jesse.
Bob Jesse,
initiate.
who's funded some tremendous research at Johns Hopkins. The Roland Griffiths group is doing superb work looking at psilocybin facilitating psychospiritual experience, which are then predictive of positive therapeutic outcomes.
Very cool.
Very cool indeed.
Yeah. Oh, and it's the next time. I don't know when the next conference is going to be. I guess it's in Europe next year, right?
Well, there was no. It's probably going to be in 2015.
Okay,
And
so you
Gaia
skip a
Media,
year?
the ones that organized the 100th anniversary of Albert Hoffman's birth, his 100th birthday in 2006, and then the conference, World Psychedelic Forum in 2008. Then they gave it back to us for our Psychedelic Science 2010, and then Psychedelic Science 2013. And so I've given it back to them to do the next one probably in 2015, and then there's a group in England called Breaking Convention that does them every 2 years. In the odd years, there's a group called the Open Institute in the Netherlands that tries to organize conferences on an irregular basis. I would say there's a good chance that the next large international conference focused on psychedelic science
In the U.S.
will probably in the U.S. will probably be 2016, because we want to
There'll
wait
be a
for
lot
the
of cool
science
stuff
to
coming
mature.
out between now and then for sure. So that'll be
That's
one
what
to
we
catch.
expect.
If you wanted to look at any of the talks, they're all online as well, which is
Yeah.
really cool. Go to maps.org and check out the talks from the Psychedelic Science 2013. Some really great
Yeah.
stuff in there as well.
Yeah, they're all up there for free. We think that public education is in some ways even more important than the research, because the public fear, the public hope about these works is what drives both the drug war or also the moves towards liberalizing and opening the door to research. So that's why
Yeah.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to the.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's one final point here. The people who are really frustrated with the government about the thing, ultimately, if enough people want something, politicians will run on that platform and
Yeah,
say, okay,
yeah.
this is what all the people want. I'm going to get elected by doing what the people
Yeah.
want. So instead of being frustrated with the politicians, go out, convince 2 or 3 friends to be open-minded and look at the research. Just look at the research for themselves with a fair and balanced opinion, and not to use Fox News' term, that was scary. But yeah, just look at it and analyze the data, come to their own conclusions, and you're actually pushing the cause forward just by doing that. And politics will react to popular demand ultimately, if the system works. So that's something that everybody can do besides, of course, contributing. And perfect timing as we're about to get kicked out of the room here, guys. But we'll have to do this again sometime. I really appreciate having you guys.
Thank you.
come on.
Thanks very
great.
much.